What's up? I've been seeing some posts like this one pop up on social media pushing the idea that leftists like to team up with fascists, I guess. So I thought I would use these memes as a springboard to talk about some stuff. This video is not about liberals in the way North Americans think of them, in opposition to conservatives or whatever. This video is about capital L liberals, proponents of Enlightenment philosophies and liberal democracies. In case you're unfamiliar with the difference, I'll fill you in real quick. Liberalism is seen as the ideology born of the Age of Enlightenment, which was a period between the 17th and 18th century where thinkers and philosophers started to heavily emphasize rationalism and empiricism in contrast to superstition and dogmatism. From there, we saw an emphasis on personal liberties, separation of church and state, progress, tolerance, and democratic governance. Things that I think are great, by the way. This served as a turning point in history where the age of the monarch, the feudal lord, and the serf was to be left behind, and the age of the free man was to come. A lot of the ideas that came out of this Enlightenment period served to drastically improve the quality of life going forward. Since such an emphasis was placed on freedom and individual liberties, the economic system that was tied to this movement was capitalism. At the time, capitalism was seen as a way to maximize personal liberties, a way for anyone to work their way to a free and happy life, and an improvement to feudalism and all the unspeakable economic arrangements that preceded it. During this period, capitalism was a very progressive system, but the people of the 18th century had no way of knowing how dangerous this economic model would be in its accelerated form. They couldn't properly gauge the ecological devastation or immense capital concentration that was to come in the next couple of centuries. There were some Enlightenment thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau who had a hunch that this shit could go wrong, and he wrote about it in his work, A Discourse on Inequality, where he took aim at things like property and wealth disparities and argued that inequality was likely to lead to despotism. But for the most part, the ideas that emerged during the Age of Enlightenment served as a massive step in the right direction. Fast forward to the modern day, and we see that Rousseau's predictions were spot on. But this doesn't mean that all the ideas that came from the Enlightenment were bad or destined to age poorly. As someone critical of capitalism, I believe that by implementing a new and more equitable economic model, we can truly live up to the values and ideals of freedom thought up during the Enlightenment. I see libertarian socialism as the logical extension of Enlightenment principles, but I digress. So, when I use the term liberal in this video, I will be referring to people or states that claim to be proponents of the ideas that emerged during the Enlightenment. The US and other Western countries claim to be liberal democracies, regardless if the party in power calls themselves liberal or conservative. This video is not going to be me attacking liberalism as much as it will be a critique on those who claim to uphold the ideas of freedom and democracy insincerely, just to use them as a cudgel to bully others who may want to organize their societies differently. There's a long history of nominal liberals acting illiberally, siding with authoritarians and discarding the values that make up what they claim to believe in, just to destroy countries and people who hold ideas different from them. So with that out of the way, let's talk about the phrase, scratch a liberal and a fascist bleeds. This is a common catchword in certain political circles, and you might have seen it on the internet. People who use this phrase are often referring to the proclivity of past liberal democracies to side with fascists in their attempts to destroy leftist movements all over the world. Some will argue that the prioritization of property rights and capitalism are so intertwined with liberalism that liberals perceive an attack on capitalism to be an attack on their very freedoms, which then leads them to siding with the illiberal to defend their economic model. Put simply, the argument is that liberals will team up with fascists if it means they can destroy leftists because leftists threaten capital. In this video, we will test that theory and go over just 3 of the many times this has happened in the past century. After the Second World War, when the Allied forces secured the W and whooped those fascists' asses, they went on to lead the world into an era of anti-fascist resistance, and they did everything in their power to defend the ideals of freedom and self-determination for every nation on Earth. No, I'm just kidding. They did the complete opposite of that. They actually teamed up with the fascists that they just spent the past half-decade fighting because the threat of communism was a much more significant issue in their eyes. Unfortunately, this has always been the case. High-level officials like the OSS's Alan Dulles notoriously endorsed a Nazi proposal to establish a separate peace between the Third Reich and the US, so that the Nazis could turn their attention toward the Soviets, whom Alan Dulles perceived to be a bigger threat. The US specifically has been unhealthily obsessed with communism, even before the Second World War. Brazen, bald-faced lies that ranged from the Bolsheviks are eating babies to they're nationalizing women were espoused by US propagandists well before World War II. Operation Gladio ensued in the immediate aftermath of the war. Gladio entailed stay-behind fascist militias, organized by NATO powers and Western intelligence agencies like the CIA and the UK's MI6. These stay-behind fascist paramilitary groups were propped up and supported all across Europe for the purpose of destroying left-wing movements when and if they arose. See, once the World War ended and the Cold War began, a struggle for dominance and hegemony between the West and its allies and the Soviets and their allies consumed the globe. NATO was a military alliance that formed so that Western countries could better fend off the Soviets if they planned to invade Western Europe or attack America. The threat of a Soviet invasion was dishonestly used time and time again by the West to excuse their own murderous and opportunistic behavior. In reality, the Soviets were heavily militarily damaged after the World War, and the act of them invading Western Europe or picking a fight with the US wasn't really in the cards. To quote from William Blum's Killing Hope, there are available, in fact, numerous internal documents from the State Department, the Defense Department, and the CIA from the post-war period, wherein one political analyst after another makes clear his serious skepticism of the Soviet threat, revealing the Russians' critical military weaknesses and/or questioning their alleged aggressive intentions, while high officials, including the president, were publicly presenting a message explicitly the opposite. But that's another story. Remember the guy I just mentioned? Alan Dulles, the one from the OSS, which later became the CIA, who really wanted to cut a deal with the Nazis and direct all attention toward fighting the Soviets. So that guy made a good amount of Nazi connections while he entertained a possible peace agreement with them. One of these connections was Nazi General Reinhard Gehlen, who, knowing that the Nazis were going to lose the war, informed Dulles of his idea to form clandestine guerrilla armies composed of Hitler Youth and other fascists who would stay behind after the war to fight off communism wherever it popped up. Since Dulles was paranoid about a potential Soviet invasion of the West, he believed that he had to develop these stay-behind fascist militias and assist them. Dulles later went on to bring Gehlen and some of his other Nazi friends to Fort Hunt, Virginia, where they had dinner with a bunch of US officials who came up with a little plan. I'll let Paul L. Williams, author of Operation Gladio, a great book on this topic, explain what this plan entailed. Gehlen would go back to Germany under US protection and create the Gehlen Organization, which would receive full funding from US Army G2 resources. The primary purpose of this organization would be the maintenance of the existing stay-behind armies and the recruitment of new guerrilla soldiers from the ranks of Third Reich veterans with staunch anti-communist credentials. These soldiers would be known as gladiators, and they would be commissioned to ward off communist invaders in the great theater of post-war Europe. The operation in which they were engaged was to be known as Gladio, after the short swords Roman gladiators used to kill their opponents. So not only did the Western liberal democracy fund literal Hitler Youth death squads and other fascist paramilitary groups all over Europe and directly work with Nazi officials to do so, but according to Paul L. Williams, the creative ways in which this operation was funded include illicit activities involving the Mafia and the Vatican. If you want more information on that, then check out his book. It's great. It's important to note that by 1987, an estimated 6 million people had died due to covert CIA operations, according to the Association for Responsible Dissent. The CIA claims these deaths were a result of a war against communism, even though a good deal of these killings took place in countries that weren't even communist, just merely a threat to American business interests. Gladio is far from the only instance of supposed proponents of liberal democracies teaming up with fascists to destroy the left. It's not even the only time they've teamed up with a former Axis power to fight communists. Shortly after the Japanese surrendered in 1945, the US began using the Japanese soldiers who were still in China to help fight the Chinese communists. At the time, China was engaged in a civil war between the communists led by Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, and the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek. Although the Chinese communists provided significant assistance to the Americans during the Second World War by offering intelligence on Japanese occupiers, rescuing and caring for downed US airmen, and more, the US ultimately chose to align more closely with Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalists. The OSS, which later became the CIA, estimated that the majority of Chiang's military effort was actually directed against the Chinese communists and not the Japanese occupiers who wreaked havoc all over China. Once the war had ended, Chiang had incorporated Japanese units into his army and began working heavily with officials who had collaborated with the Japanese and served in their puppet government. You would think that, having just fought a bloody and brutal war against the Japanese, the US would steer clear of aiding Chiang's nationalist army, considering it was packed with their former fascist enemies, but no. Since Chiang Kai-shek was relentlessly anti-communist, the US had no qualms about supporting him and his nationalist army. In fact, in President Truman's memoirs, he wrote about using enemy Japanese troops to hold off the Chinese communists. Quote, It was perfectly clear to us that if we told the Japanese to lay down their arms immediately and march to the seaboard, the entire country would be taken over by the communists. We therefore had to take the step of using the enemy as a garrison until we could airlift Chinese national troops to South China and send Marines to guard the seaports. The US transported nationalist troops all over China and Manchuria. About 500,000 of them were sent by ships and planes in the attempt to get them to important centers and ports before the communists. The American involvement in the Chinese Civil War quickly reached the point of having US Marines sent into China to guard railroads, mines, bridges, and more for the nationalists. This eventually escalated to US involvement in the fighting as well. US soldiers began attacking areas controlled by the communists. There are also reports of them indiscriminately shelling civilian villages. An interesting detail that caught my attention while researching this conflict was the fact that even after the US troops attacked Chinese communists and the villages they controlled, the communists would still rescue downed American airmen and tend to their wounds whenever they would crash. William Blum chalks this up to the fact that, at the time, the US was internationally respected and admired, and Chinese peasants, communist or not, may have still looked up to the Americans. After a while, the US troops who were stationed in China began to question why they were still in Asia and not back home. The Second World War had come to an end, so it was reasonable for these troops to be confused. The official US explanation for keeping its troops in China was that the US soldiers needed to disarm and kick out the Japanese, which did happen eventually, but the real priority of the US military presence in China was to aid the nationalists and fight the communists. A chilling quote from a US Marine lieutenant in 1945 goes, "You can't tell a man that he's here to disarm the Japanese when he's guarding the same railway with the Japanese." Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist army was notorious for its oppressive practices, harboring former Japanese fascists and acting cruelly to the civilian population. In stark contrast, areas under communist control were often characterized by honesty, fairness, and strong civilian support. Despite this, the US, fully aware of Chiang's brutality, the world's worst leadership is what the head of the US military mission in China called it, still chose to align itself with the nationalists. During the Nazi occupation of Greece in World War II, the resistance was primarily led by the ELAS, the People's Liberation Army. The ELAS was founded in the early 1940s on the initiative of the Greek Communist Party, and its guerrillas successfully fought off the Nazi invaders and liberated large areas of Greece. After a good amount of the heavy lifting was done and the majority of Nazis fled Greece, the British Army arrived in the country in late 1944. It's important to note that Britain viewed Greece as its private playground, so when the ELAS liberated it from the Nazis and began to usher in a new way of life, Britain wasn't too happy. The ELAS were progressive in many areas. They emphasized education and fighting illiteracy. They were also known for their somewhat progressive views regarding women and calling upon them to act autonomously and independently of their husband's control. This proved to be a popular movement among the people of Greece as the EAM, the political wing of the ELAS, grew into the millions. But this new worldview and disruption of the status quo was too much for Britain. God forbid Greece exercise self-determination, I guess. Churchill, who did not shy away from praising the ELAS as they were fighting off the Nazis and aiding the Allied cause, was adamant about restoring the Greek king as soon as the Nazi threat in Greece dissipated. The British military in Greece got straight to installing a government committed to their goals. This government found itself packed full of monarchists and conservatives who despised the progressive ideas of the new Greek left. The new Greek army and police force were also stacked with these rightists. This resulted in the deaths and imprisonments of members of the ELAS and EAM. Eventually, fighting broke out between the ELAS and British forces. The Brits had backup from non-ELAS Greek fighters, many of whom had actually collaborated with the Nazis during the occupation. So now, the Greek leftists weren't just up against the British and their new right-wing government, but they were also fighting these right-wing militias that had worked with the Germans and were now teaming up with the Brits. As the fighting went on, the US jumped in to help the British and the new right-wing Greek government, because if there's one thing the US loves, it's fighting commies. Things were looking pretty grim for the Greek leftists. They were stuck in a civil war against much stronger enemies, and the Soviets chose not to support them because Stalin thought their efforts were futile. So they turned to Yugoslavia for aid, which supplied them with arms and sanctuary. As the British became preoccupied with trying to rebuild their own country in the aftermath of World War II, it became increasingly difficult and unwise of them to continue the fight against leftists in Greece, especially since the ELAS persisted relentlessly. They were not giving up in their fight. This led to the US picking up where the British left off, a little bit of liberal tag team. The government in Greece by this point was corrupt and still backed by the US and the British. It was known to terrorize leftists and torture them in island prison camps. Officials in Washington were fully aware that their client government in Greece was a human rights disaster, and even staunch American anti-communists were disgusted by it. By the end of 1947, American aid was entirely supporting the Greek military. This included weaponry, food, and clothing. Hundreds of millions of dollars of supplies and equipment was given to the Greeks by the US. The Americans even created a secret army reserve composed of those Greek Nazi collaborators I mentioned earlier. This freedom-loving harbinger of liberalism and democracy just couldn't stop teaming up with its old fascist enemies. The Americans became so wrapped up in the fighting in Greece that their involvement was no longer just funding and aiding the Greek military in their fight against the ELAS guerrillas. The US military mission eventually took over the development of battle plans from the Greek generals and sent over 250 American army officers to the country to make sure Greek army divisions were complying with US directives. By 1949, the US had successfully defeated the ELAS and fulfilled its goal to keep Greece as its little puppet state. The US remained heavily involved in the Greek government, with Greek prime ministers coming to power only after US suggestions or demands. This caused Greek politicians to grow upset at the American influence over their country and the lack of Greek autonomy. The US did not appreciate these troublemakers drawing attention to how much undue influence the US had over Greece, so in 1967 it supported a coup and a subsequent military dictatorship. Their best bet was to just get rid of democracy altogether, I guess. The fascist junta that took over Greece in 1967 ruled the country brutally until 1974, and it too enjoyed the support of the US. George Papadopoulos, the de facto leader of this junta, was on the CIA's payroll for about 15 years leading up to the coup and was a Nazi collaborator during the 1940s under the German occupation of Greece. Like I said earlier, this video is not me attacking liberals. I don't see the point in that, but I do think it's important to shed light on past alliances between those who claim to be acting in the pursuit of spreading freedom and democracy when in actuality, they were just bullies and murderers. The ideas of the Enlightenment, freedom, reason, empiricism, democracy, they are worth protecting and upholding, but historically, those who purported to do so lied. Before I go, I would be remiss to act as though the Soviets never flirted with the idea of working with fascists. From the German-Soviet Axis talks, non-aggression treaty, to the supplying of Nazi Germany with raw materials like oil in exchange for German machinery and manufactured goods, this is behavior that modern leftists would never forgive or try to excuse if carried out by any other country. It's almost as though Stalinism, although extremely nuanced and impossible to properly touch on as a footnote, was chock full of mistakes and deviations from socialist principles. Now, this does not mean that leftists have some sort of proclivity to side with fascists, as some may argue. From the aforementioned ELAS in Greece, who fought off the German occupation, anarchists in Spain who resisted Francoism, Tito's partisan forces who liberated Yugoslavia from the Nazis, and many more left-wing groups all across Latin America, Asia, and Africa. Just because Stalinists entertained such a betrayal in the beginning of the war, although they more than made up for it on the Eastern Front later, does not mean that leftists haven't historically offered a natural, almost instinctive opposition to fascism time and time again. I bring this up because it's important to hold people who claim to be socialists to the same standard we hold others to. Resisting fascism should be a universal ideal, and that should not be a controversial thing to say. That's all I have for this video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe. And if you didn't like it, give it a thumbs down, comment in a mean way, and still subscribe. Thanks.